At the conclusion of World War II, the world was not celebrating victory as much as it was staring at the ruin. Entire cities had been leveled, economies had collapsed, and nations emerged from one of the most violent catastrophes in human history. Europe, in particular, was at its weakest. Major powers had lost their armies, their industries were destroyed, and their borders lay open to any power capable of expansion. At that moment, the danger was not just the return of conventional warfare, but a total security vacuum that could swallow the entire continent. In contrast, the United States emerged from the war as an unprecedented superpower. Its economy was at its peak, its military industry was operating at full capacity, and its army had not experienced the destruction that European armies had endured. As for the Soviet Union, despite its staggering human losses, it emerged with a massive military force effectively stationed in the heart of Eastern Europe. And here, the real anxiety began. The question was no longer, will a new war break out? Instead, it was, when and where will it start? According to Western political analysis of that period, the greatest fear was that the Soviet Union would exploit Europe's weakness to extend its political and military influence without the need for a direct confrontation. The United States found itself facing two choices and no third. Either withdraw from the continent and leave European nations to face their fate alone, or stay and build a new security system to prevent any power from dominating Europe again. This decision was not purely moral, it was strategic in the highest sense. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was officially established. NATO was not just a traditional military alliance, it was a new concept in international relations based on the principle of collective deterrence. The idea was simple: an attack on one member is a declaration of war against all. On the surface, NATO was presented as a defensive shield aimed at protecting Europe and preventing a recurrence of past tragedies. The official rhetoric focused on peace, stability, and preventing a third world war, which this time could be nuclear and utterly cataclysmic. But behind this rhetoric lay deeper calculations. According to documents and subsequent analyses, NATO was also a means to ensure continued American influence in Europe, linking the continent's security to Washington and preventing any independent European rapprochement with Moscow. The Soviet Union did not view NATO as an innocent defensive alliance. Rather, it saw it as a military noose tightening around its borders and an ideological alliance aimed at surrounding it politically and militarily. This perception was not entirely illusory. It was based on the reality of expanding NATO bases and influence. With the founding of NATO, the world was no longer the same. Conflicts were no longer measured solely by armies and battles, but by balances, alliances, and the ability of each side to deter the other without firing a shot. Thus, the Cold War was born. The world was clearly divided: East versus West, socialism versus capitalism, two alliances standing at opposite ends of almost everything. There were no direct battles, yet tension was present in every political decision and every military movement. The arms race began, and with it, a new era of global fear. Nuclear missiles, military bases, maneuvers, and indirect messages warned that any small mistake could set the entire world ablaze. As the years passed, NATO began to expand. Each country that joined claimed it was seeking security, but every expansion was read in Moscow as a new hostile step. Here, the tension began to shift from a theoretical concept into a long-term conflict. NATO was no longer just a military alliance, it became a major player in shaping the New World Order, a system built on power, deterrence, and closed alliances, where peace is maintained not by trust, but by the fear of consequences. And so, from the ashes of World War II, a new world was born. A world that does not live in an open war, but lives constantly on the brink of one. A world whose repercussions of its decisions would be felt for decades to come. And perhaps even to this very day, By the end of the 1980s, the problem was not the number of tanks or missiles, but something far more dangerous. The system carrying the Soviet Union began to collapse from within, slowly and silently. The economy was staggering, the state was bloated, and the long military race had exhausted Moscow more than it officially admitted. In 1991, the unthinkable happened. The Soviet Union disintegrated, and a power that controlled nearly half the world collapsed without a single shot being fired. Russia was reborn, but it was not born strong. It was burdened by defeat, debt, and the loss of influence and prestige built over generations. The nations that were once part of the Soviet bloc suddenly woke up politically free, yet security conscious and fearful, not knowing who would protect them in a world without balance. Here, the vacuum began, and in international politics, a vacuum never remains empty. The United States emerged from the Cold War as a sole superpower without a real rival, and NATO found itself facing an existential question. What is the need for an alliance built primarily to confront an enemy that no longer exists? The answer was not dissolution or dismantling, but expansion, step by step, eastward toward countries that were once part of the Soviet bloc. In the 1990s, Eastern European countries began knocking on NATO's door, not just out of love for the West, but out of fear that Russia might one day return. Poland, Czechia, Hungary, and later the Baltic states all saw NATO as the ultimate security guarantee. From their perspective, the decision was logical. Small nations emerging from decades of dominance, seeking a protective shield. But in Moscow, the picture was entirely different. Russia did not view NATO's expansion as a sovereign choice of independent states, but as a slow creep toward its borders, an undeclared breach of the balance promised after the Cold War ended. According to testimonies from former officials and Western reports, Moscow received unwritten signals in the early 1990s that NATO would not expand eastward. These promises were never recorded in formal treaties, but they remained in the Russian memory as a moral pledge that was later broken. With every new country joining NATO, the geographical distance between the alliance's forces and Russia shrank. With every new military base, Moscow felt the noose tightening, not just militarily, but psychologically and historically. During Boris Yeltsin's era, Russia was too weak to respond, but it did not forget. With Vladimir Putin's rise to power at the turn of the millennium, everything changed. Putin did not see the fall of the Soviet Union as a victory for freedom, but as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, in his famous words. From that moment, Russia began rebuilding itself, not just its economy and military, but its identity and role in the world. NATO, for its part, continued to expand, considering itself a defensive alliance that posed no threat, but Russia never bought that narrative. The real rift was not in the number of soldiers, but in the total absence of trust. Each side viewed its own moves as defensive and the other's moves as aggressive. Thus, without a formal declaration of war, a new phase began, a phase of cold tension, but more dangerous than before. Eastern Europe became a tug-of-war arena. Russia felt besieged, while NATO believed it was preventing history from repeating itself. And here, the first seeds of the coming conflict were sown. No one was talking about Ukraine as a red line yet, but the path had begun, slowly, quietly, and with a lethality that the world would only realize much later.
As the years passed, the map of tension became clearer. The conflict was no longer a theoretical dispute over expansion or influence. It shifted into specific geographical points measured in kilometers, missiles, and military bases. The most sensitive of these points was Ukraine, a country situated literally between two worlds, neither fully Western nor fully Russian. For the West, Ukraine is a sovereign state with the right to choose its alliances and political future without anyone's guardianship. However, for Russia, according to official rhetoric and analyses, Ukraine is not just a neighboring country, but a part of Russia's historical and security depth. Kiev is not an ordinary city in the Russian consciousness. It is considered the cradle of the first Russian state, from which the political and cultural identity that predated Moscow itself was formed. Therefore, the idea of Ukraine joining NATO was viewed in Moscow not as a mere political development, but as a direct existential threat. According to military reports and analyses published in Western newspapers, NATO forces reaching Ukraine would mean reducing the flight time of missiles to Moscow to mere minutes. In 2014, the crisis exploded openly for the first time when popular protests toppled the pro-Russian Ukrainian government. Russia viewed what happened as a Western-backed coup, while the West saw it as a popular revolution demanding liberation and integration into Europe. The Russian response was swift, with the annexation of Crimea, a move that fundamentally changed the rules of the game. From that moment, relations between Russia and the West entered a new phase of overt hostility. Sanctions began, diplomatic language shifted, and Ukraine became a theater for a proxy struggle between two superpowers. Years passed with escalating tension and sharpening rhetoric, yet the world treated it as a containable crisis. Until 2022 arrived. In February, the world woke up to the news of a full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, the largest military operation Europe had witnessed since World War II. Russia stated, per official declarations, that the goal was to protect its national security and prevent NATO's expansion. The West, meanwhile, saw the invasion as a flagrant violation of international law and a threat to the entire global order. NATO did not enter the war directly, but it threw in its full weight in other ways: weapons, intelligence, financial support, and unprecedented military training to Ukrainian forces. Thus, the war turned into an indirect confrontation between Russia and NATO, a war managed without the two parties ever meeting face-to-face. The world was divided once again. The global economy was impacted. Energy, food, inflation, and crises hit countries that hadn't fired a single bullet. According to international economic reports, the war was no longer confined to the front lines. It extended into the daily lives of people everywhere. As the war persists, the question has become more dangerous than simply who will win. The question is, how far can this conflict go? Are we facing a long war of attrition that exhausts everyone? Or are we facing a spark that could spiral out of control in a single moment? The story of NATO and Russia is not a simple tale of absolute good or evil. It is a story of interests, fears, a long history of suspicion, and decisions made under the pressure of fear rather than trust. Each side believes it is defending itself, and every defensive step by one is interpreted as an existential threat by the other. Ukraine was not the sole cause, but it was the flashpoint, the point where history, geography, power, and fear converged in a single moment. Today, the world is not living through a declared world war, but it is living through a global tension open to all possibilities. Perhaps this story will not end soon. Perhaps its next chapters will be written in ways no one imagined. But what is certain is that the tremors of what began after World War II continue to shake the world to this day. The real question remains, does the world learn from its history, or is it rewriting it in a much more dangerous way?